We tend to think of perhaps a strategic rivalry between China and the US. Beyond that, the strategic rivalries in the region we tend to think of as between regional states, within the region rivalries. Are they significant? You know, some of us have been disturbed by issues of Chinese oil drilling rigs being towed into claimed Vietnamese waters and by unilateral declarations of airspace and the like. We naturally think that as states grow more powerful, become more economically successful, they do tend to build their military capabilities. It's just been the way these things have happened, and as such, they too tend to test each other strategically. So the issue for this panel is, what is happening in this regard? Is it significant? Should it be causing Australia, the US, or both of us together concern? And if so, what should we do about it? You know, we Australians are very conscious that we have done well out of the peace and stability of the Asia-Pacific region, which has been guaranteed by the US taxpayer in many ways. But nothing stays still, so that's what this panel is going to explore. We have a great panel to do it. You have their bios in your papers. We'll ask for contributions in the order that they appear. So I'm going 3 professors, but practitioners as well, I think, in many ways. But I'm going to start with Professor Tom Plate, who's a very distinguished journalist and writer, as well as being a professor, former editor of the editorial pages of the LA Times, founder of the Asia Media International. His most recent book is In the Middle of China's Future, Tom Plate on Asia. And he just told me he's giving a discount today, so it's a
deep discount.
A deep discount. So, Tom, you've observed the region all your adult life, and we'd like to hear your views on this subject of the emerging strategic rivalries and how should we address them.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. As some of you know, I'm quite opinionated on this issue, so that won't be a problem. And I'll try not to be too moderate. If I do not seem provocative, then I fail to provoke you, and I'll try harder. But before I do start, I want to thank the International Institute of UCLA and the Burkle Center, and particularly my favorite professor, Cal Rustiala, for inviting me. And I would also like to thank the Australian government for wanting me to be on the panel. I don't know that the present members quite know it, but in a very minor footnote of Good Day USA, you will go back 10 years, 2004, when John Olson was here, and I helped him start Good Day LA, and then that was such a success that it became Good Day USA, and he went to New York. So if you want to know who's really primarily responsible for the success of the entire thing, with my usual modesty, I'd have to admit that it was myself. I also want to say, and sometimes you hear this and it's insincere, in this particular case it is not insincere, that I'm very honored to be on a panel with Professor Kang, who has done amazing work in international relations, and particularly in the area of Asia, is really, I think, one of the most insightful of commentators on the area of the world that I'm interested in, which is Asia. And of course, I'm at LMU now, but I primarily have been loyal to UCLA, and so it pains me to admit that someone at USC would have eminence, but he really does. And then I think Susan Shark, a word needs to be said about her. She is, of course, at UCST, which is absolutely gorgeous, and a place where anybody who isn't happy there, something wrong with them. But in addition, she was a very important State Department official in the Clinton administration, and I think deserves a lot of credit for opening up some issues. And I think her scholarship works particularly well in informing us in important ways. And so, as you look at my title on my business card, which is Distinguished Scholar of Asian Pacific Studies, those things are not really true. I'm not distinguished. and I'm not particularly a scholar. These two are scholars. What I am is a journalist, and I know that's a morally indefensible position to have, but it gives you one advantage, and that is journalists are constantly required to deal with reality as you perceive it on the first look. And so if I am a distinguished scholar, which I don't think I am, I will say I'm a distinguished scholar who doesn't do footnotes. So I don't do any footnotes. So I think what I'm going to do, and then I can't wait to hear what David and Susan have to say, and I mean that, is I'm going to tell you 3 stories, because that's what journalists do. And the 3 stories frame for me what we're talking about at this important symposium. And all 3 stories come from people that I talk to when I do my work. And my work is to going out there and talking to people who are smart. And some years ago, I was out there in Southeast Asia, and I said to a foreign minister of a high-profile country, I said, you know, I try to explain to my students what's happening with the rise of China, but it's really complicated. And, you know, and students, particularly these days, they don't have a huge attention span. I don't have a huge attention span. So could you give me a simple way of sort of encapsulating it, and then we can work from there to the profundities. And he says, well, I'm going to explain to you, and he did. And he gave me something that I think is very valuable. Some of you have heard of it. Perhaps quite a few of you haven't. But I think it is valuable, and I call it the metaphor of the second sun. And by sun, I don't mean Kim Jong-un or anything. I mean S-U-N. And basically, what you have, according to my source, is you have a geopolitical universe that for the 20th century has had these planets revolving around a central sun. And this sun is very hot and very, very powerful, and the planets have had to arrange their orbits so they don't get too close to the sun and burn up, or too close to other planets and bump into them. And of course, some planets have done it more successfully than others. We've done it particularly well. Maybe Mars once did it right. Some of them are too far away and cold, and some are too close and it's too hot. But that's the structure, really, of the geopolitical universe. Now, and it's been settled, and so all the orbits are settled. And there's not, you know, you don't wake up the next day and say, well, do I have to readjust my orbit? But now, you're 21st century, the metaphor of the second sun. There's another S-U-N coming slowly and slowly into the solar system, you see? And that sun is exerting a huge magnetic, powerful physical pull on all the planets. And as it's moving closer, these planets that had these settled orbits, right, now have to figure out how to recalibrate their orbit in a way that they may not want to get too close to the second sun, and they also don't want to get too far away from the first sun. And what's going on now is a tremendous recalibration of the geopolitical orbit, you see? And of course, obviously, I'm talking about China as being the second sun, you see? Now, India, for example, is Jupiter rising. It's the largest planet. And Jupiter now is rising, and Jupiter now has to figure out, do I have to recalibrate my orbit? This is a difficult and ongoing proposition, and what you're seeing now basically in the world is related to the rise of the second sun. And I would just say to my Australian friends that do you think that you have settled on your orbit as of today? My answer for them would be, since the ones that I know are very, very smart, I don't know too many in the pubs of Darwin at midnight, but the Australians that I know are very, very smart, and I do not believe that they think that their orbit is settled. It's an ongoing process. It's going to take recalibration, and it'll be difficult. So that's the metaphor of the second sun. The second story is, I call My Friend the Spy. And when I was in Beijing a few months ago, I decided to have dinner with my friend, who is allegedly a diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But he knows that I know that he knows that I know that he's a member of the Ministry of State Security. He's a spook, he's a spy, but we're okay with that. We get along really well. In fact, I rather like him. And he's sure I'm not CIA, which is true, I'm not. And they have ways of checking it out. so he's right. And but I like to tease him a little. So I was teasing, we were having dinner in Beijing. And I said to him, you know, why are you so paranoid about this U.S. Containment thing? You know, I mean, why don't you just relax a little, you know? I mean, we're innocent Americans. We wouldn't contain anybody. We wouldn't do anything negative to you. I mean, we're fine with communism. And we have no anti-communist history in America. You know, just relax. Well, she says, well, Tom, he says, what about that new base you're going to have in Korea? What's that about? Oh, yeah, yes, yeah, but we can't talk about that. It's secret, but yeah, but don't worry about that. So he says, well, now you have this new thing in Singapore where you're going to put up thousands of soldiers and so forth, and kind of what's going in there, huh? What is that about? Oh, yeah, but don't worry about that. That's just the Sings. They're hedging their bets. Don't worry about that. Well, now you're going to, but wait a minute now. Now you're going to send 2,500 Marines to Darwin. What's that about? Oh, don't worry about that, you know. Australia's far away, and they're just a fun group, and don't worry about them. They'll be fine. He says, well, actually, he said, you know, we aren't worried about Australia because, can you believe it? The government, in its nice, courteous, and thoughtful way, offered to give us, the Chinese, a similar option to put 2,500 troops on Australia. And I thought, Ambassador Beasley, I don't know why you didn't mention that in your presentation, but yeah, well, they really appreciate the way you're balancing, you see, you know. So I think that we need to, if I may say, we need to really look at things harder the way the Chinese look at them. Now, the ambassador says in the cable traffic that he saw, the Chinese have gotten over the whole containment thing. Well, remember, the cable traffic that he saw is from the highest and most sophisticated, the brightest people in China. A lot of people in China don't have that view, and nationalism and so forth is a big force in China, and public opinion is important even in a so-called totalitarian state. So I would just leave that there. Final thing, which this is really designed to make you slightly angry. So I hope this works. And then we'll go to Professor Kang. I was in Hanoi, and I was interviewing a very old lady. But she wasn't always an old lady. When she was a young lady, she was an aide to, in the Vietnamese negotiations at Paris, on the Paris peace talks. Her name is Madame Bin. You probably, Ambassador knows her. And she's a very distinguished, impressive lady now. But when she was in her 20s, she was hot stuff. And there was word, I can't say, but a certain American negotiator with a heavy German accent was very taken with this lady. And so she has quite a history. And I also heard that when she came back to Hanoi after that trip in Paris, she had 2 extra suitcases filled with clothes that she brought in Paris that you couldn't get in Hanoi. I happened to interview her when she was about 84 in Hanoi. She granted me an interview. And she was the kind of lady that when you looked at her, you could see there was wisdom, whether she's communist or capitalist or whatever. And I'm going to finish on this note. And that is that she is someone you listen to. And she answered the questions really well. And then I said, finally, I said, do you have any advice for the American people? And she said this, my advice to the American people is, be as nice as possible to China during its rise, so that maybe China will feel obligated to be nice to you during your descent. Okay? That's how Asia looks at things, and I thought we should have I should bring this to you, and so my conclusion is that as a result of this reporting, which I've done for the last 20 years, I have a new psychological malady. The malady is known as post-Cold War traumatic stress disorder. And my pitch to you would be that for America or Australia to base any policy on exclusion as opposed to inclusion, on division rather than going extra miles to bridge gaps, and with the result we wind up dividing Asia into the good guys and the bad guys, is going to be a tragic legacy to give to future generations. That's my view.
Right. Well, that was a provocative start in, with good journalistic license.
Thank you, sir.
I'm not opposed to soft power either.
What does journalist's license mean?
No. I'd like to have a go, but then we won't have time for our other 2 distinguished contributors. Yes, so let's move to David Kang, Professor Kang, Professor of International Relations and Business, as you've heard at USC, Also directs the Korean Studies Institute and the East Asian Studies Centre, written many books, his latest, East Asia Before the West, and he's a regular commentator, so he may not be a journalist, but he contributes to public debate. David, what are your thoughts?
All right, well, thank you. First of all, it is a pleasure to be
He told
here.
me he'd be provocative too, so I'm starting to worry a bit.
Well, I can't be as provocative as Tom, but it is a real honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be with Susan and Tom. I'm going to take a sort of similar stance. It'll be interesting to see what the three of us talk about, because in many ways, my view of the region comports pretty much to what Tom said. I'm not sure I would say it the same way. And usually panels are best if you have different points of view. But I would say that I think my view is provocative when we were talking about it earlier, because I'll do talks like this a lot. I was just in Australia last year at ANU and gave a talk. And the basic point that I always make, particularly to Americans, so this is probably not the right audience, but to Americans, is that most Asian countries don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. They really don't want to have to do that. That's the worst situation for them. And this is not what I think most Americans sort of expect, that a rising country threatening everything else, right? So that's the one point I usually make to Americans. And when I go to the region and make this comment, people usually sort of nod their head, because it's fairly obvious if you're in the region. So what I thought I would do is say why I think that's the case, why I think that in terms of security or geopolitical reasons, the region is not as dangerous as people like to think, or perhaps the media like to make it out to be. And then maybe conclude on a less optimistic note by talking about the kind of issues or the challenges that I think do exist, which I think are much more economic and diplomatic than they are security. So it's not to say that the region is doing fine. I think there is a tremendous amount of renegotiation, of adjustment going on. But fundamentally, I think the region is far more stable now than it was 50 years ago. And that's where we start. We just got through 2014, and I'm sure all of you saw the slew of, in some ways lazy, in some ways obvious, 1914 comparisons to Asia in 2014. I mean, everyone and their cousin who was a professor of IR wrote an article about how in 1914, rising powers and nationalism, blah, blah, Asia is 20-foot China, et cetera. It's going to be the same. And I tried in my little way to say that's the wrong analogy. I have consistently argued that I don't like using European history and planting it over on Asia and saying, well, it happened in Europe, therefore it will happen in Asia. And I just find that just so, frankly, lazy. What I say is, and what I tried to write was, why don't we use Asian history and see what we might learn? And why did Asia get in trouble in the early part of the 20th century? Was because China, the Qing dynasty, was a collapsing dynasty. It was weak. There was a power vacuum. At the end of 3 centuries, when the Qing, from 1600 to 1911, the Qing had been this incredible dynasty in the middle of Asia. And it was collapsing. It was under assault by the Japanese, who were moving into a power vacuum. Its collapse was aided by Western imperialism from the unequal treaties. We all know this, but it's worth repeating. The British, the Americans, the French, everybody was carving up Asia. So this is why, Vietnam, Dutch in Indonesia. So there was massive Western intervention. China was very weak. Japan moved in half a century, 50 years of war, invasion, revolution, new countries. The Asia in 21st century is totally different. First of all, there are no Western imperial powers, not anything close to what was happening a century ago. To destabilize, foment, there's other ways in which we are involved. But the idea that any external power is coming in to try and conquer literally conquer these countries is simply absent. But even more important, as we've all talked about, China is not a power vacuum. It's incredibly strong now. There is no power vacuum in East Asia today. There is no power vacuum that is going to draw in countries to try and vie for leadership in the same kind of way. perhaps the most provocative thing I can say is an idea I'm fooling around with, which is the regional power transition. The minister mentioned before the Thucydides, the power transition, Agnes Madison. I'm very impressed at his knowledge. But the regional power transition is over. There is no more China's rise in the region. Japan, and I had these numbers, I will, but if you go back 25 years, Japan's GDP as a percentage of the region was about half. Now China's is about half. They have switched places. We know that China's role in trade, Japan's role in trade in the mid-1980s was well over half. Now China is well over half. The transition in the region is done. China has taken its place back in the center, and Japan no longer is anywhere near as influential as it was in 25 years ago. And as was mentioned earlier, the speed with which this occurred is blinding. You can watch it on a daily basis as countries stop trading with Japan and they trade with China, or as China's GDP grew. But the transition is over. The question is no longer, can China rise? What happens if China rises? Just wait. In the region, the only question is, how much bigger will China get than everybody else? Now, what's interesting about that is two things. The first one is, it may not matter because it may only be a global transition. I'm not so sure that's true because in the region, but they still haven't caught the United States. But does it really matter for the region if China is so much bigger than everybody else but hasn't caught the United States? Maybe, maybe not. But certainly in the region, I don't think any country has any realistic goal of being bigger than China, et cetera, et cetera. More importantly, though, for all the hand-wringing and the clucking of feathers and things like that about power transitions, it was done peacefully. There was no war. So we still may get war. I'm not saying there isn't the possibility for that. Of course, there could be mistakes and things. But the power transition in the region is over, and there hasn't been war. There hasn't been anything close to it, actually. And in fact, I would argue that today the region is far more stable than it was 50 years ago. If you go back 50 years to Vietnam, right, there were civil wars in Vietnam, Malaysia and Singapore, the confrontazi. Australia was all about this, right? Indonesia, the Philippines, still going on today, Korea. The only two countries that fear for their survival today in the entire region are North Korea and Taiwan. So no matter what else is going on, and that could be a real issue. I mean, I made my career studying North Korea. Right? That could be an issue, but compared to the unsettled situation in 1965, 1970, countries are stronger, they're richer, they're more stable. So in many ways, it's not a surprise that countries aren't planning on going to war and that they don't really want to choose because there's enormous benefits from having good relations with China. Trade, tourism, et cetera, right? There's enormous benefits to having good relations with the United States. And unless national survival is threatened, countries don't want to choose necessarily. And I love the quote from the Vietnamese of that lady, because Vietnamese may not love China, but they're going to live next to them. I studied Korea. Koreans are going to live next to China. It's not going away. China could have a 50% chaos of economy, and it would still be bigger than every country it's next to. And it could, it could have this massive economic problem, and it would still be bigger. And everybody in the region knows that. So the issue isn't what's going to happen with China. The issue is how do we live with something that's really big. Now, the pessimism, that's the wrong way to put it. The challenges, in other words, I think, yes, there are military challenges. There are some uninhabited rocks in the water. There are potential, U.S., China, the flight, they bumping noses. There are definitely military challenges. But if you ask me what I think are the challenges of the future, this is where I think the Obama administration got it right. I think they've gotten sidetracked, but the way they stated the pivot was, first, it's diplomatic. It's forward-deployed engagement, forward-deployed diplomacy. That's what Hillary Clinton said. Secondly is trade and economic strategy. The pivot was designed to relieve the burden on the military. Military is supposed to be third, that we have used it too much as the front. And over the years, I think, the Obama administration has, but I think that message has gotten a little muddled. And I think now most of us, when we think about the pivot, think, oh, Darwin, LCS in Singapore. But I would say, I think the Obama administration got it right, and I would encourage them to continue with dealing with diplomacy, with dealing with economics, with dealing with business and tourism and all the issues that I think that the political leaders and the business leaders, when they wake up in Hanoi, in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Canberra, those are the things that they worry about first. And so my message is actually in some ways optimistic, but in other ways I think the United States has lost some of its focus on what it could be doing really well to help the region. And so I think I've talked. Let me conclude by saying one last thing, which is, there is this fundamental question about, can the U.S. and China live with each other? I'm going to conclude by saying that will be determined by the leaderships in China, the United States, and the region. I don't think there is anything inevitable about whether they have to compete or whether they have to get along, right? I think this is going to be determined by the decisions that we make. Because one of the things that you see about these two countries, in many ways, they're both massive continental countries with enormous pride and exceptionalist views of themselves, right? I mean, they're very similar in a lot of ways. They also have very different priorities and goals, right? And so I think that the real task is for the United States and China to be able to figure out how to live with each other. And does it matter if, the status of one is a little higher than the other in certain kinds of things? So I actually am cautiously optimistic, to use an overused phrase. But I really think that the issues are not strategic or military. I think they're economic and diplomatic. So I will stop there and look forward to hearing what Susan has to say.
Thank you, David. That's, the real story is they have to live with each other because they're economically interdependent. But I was thinking my last visit to Vietnam, they're still as nervous of China as they've ever been.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe they've got nothing to be nervous about. It's hard for me to say that to them. Susan, you are obviously also a distinguished academic, professor of China and Pacific Relations at UC San Diego, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, very active in foundations working in this area and contributing to second-track diplomacy, so a bit of soft power there, and also working within the business sector, another important exercise of soft power, or some would say real power. What do you think, Susan?
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here. When Cal Rostiala invites me to things, I like to come because I know they're going to be really high quality, and I love Australia, and I figure if I drive up and back on the freeway today from San Diego to Los Angeles, maybe I'll get more invitations to Australia.
Yeah, all right.
So the fundamental fact about China's international behavior that I think we need to start out with is the fact that China's leaders are much more worried about domestic threats than international threats. They are, yes, China is big and it's had a kind of miraculous emergence as a major economic power and regional and global power. But the most important fact about understanding China is that China's leaders are actually extremely insecure and nervous about how long the Chinese Communist Party can rule China. And this anxiety is important to keep in mind as we look both at Chinese domestic politics and at foreign policy. And one reason that China's leaders, there are many reasons that they feel so nervous, but one is that after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, China's leaders didn't have the charisma and personal following that their predecessors did. Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping are basically ordinary politicians who work their way up the ladder. And China's leaders have been first among equals in a collective leadership, with each leader weaker than the previous one, until now. Much to everyone's surprise, including mine, Xi Jinping is trying to reverse this trend and rule like a strong man, to create charisma and even something of a cult of personality like Mao Zedong. So what does this mean for foreign policy is my main focus today. In domestic politics, I think it is having some very significant consequences that are mostly bad. You know, when Deng Xiaoping came into office after Mao died, and as the architect of China's market reforms, he sought to regularize the leadership system and prevent over-concentration of power at the top, because under Mao, Mao's dictatorial rule, with no one having the guts to stand up to and tell him that his ideas were fairly harebrained, China was taken in a very negative direction in the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. Tragic, tragic campaigns with terrible consequences for Chinese society. So when we see a leader in China trying to concentrate power again, this definitely sets off alarm bells among folks in China, although Xi Jinping is extremely popular among the ordinary public in China. But there are many people in China who are very, very worried and feel that Xi's approach to governing is creating an atmosphere of fear and tremendous repression. The anti-corruption campaign that's impacting every parts of the government, including the military, and the ideological tightening, returning to a lot of Mao Zedong-era concepts and approaches to ideological education, dialectical materialism, et cetera, in the universities, where my colleagues there tell me that some professors are getting fired simply for what they say in the classroom. We see the impact on the media and the internet and on civil society. So, you know, Xi Jinping's view, as it's been explained to me on some recent visits to China, is that Jiang Zemin and particularly Hu Jintao were very weak, ineffective leaders, very indecisive, and that now is the time for more decisive leadership. As the son of an old revolutionary, colleague of Deng Xiaoping's and Mao Zedong's, a princeling, or part of the red nobility, he feels that basically these fairly incompetent people with no particular pedigree were self-made politicians, is really what they were governing China very incompetently in a way that was damaging to China, just until he and his generation of princelings were ready to take over the party and the country from their fathers. So that's their mindset about what they're doing. When it comes to foreign policy, I'm not going to describe all the ways in which he has concentrated power. We've been reading a lot about it, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But what is the consequence for foreign policy? I'd like to suggest that actually it might be pretty good. That some of the most serious problems in China's relations with its neighbors were due to the fact that you did have all of these different bureaucratic interest groups going their own way, trying to pick fights, say, in the South China Sea, with other claimants in order to increase the importance of their bureaucracies, get bigger budgets, more ships, more planes, whatever. And this goes for the military as well, but also mainly these civilian maritime agencies, which now, under Xi Jinping, have been merged into one Coast Guard. So, I think that has been reported as somehow a threatening thing, and certainly inside China, they try to depict it as making China more capable of defending its sovereignty claims. But I think it also might lead to greater restraint and greater pragmatism in that effort. Now, there are a lot of signs that Xi Jinping is trying to recalibrate China's regional policy as well as China's policy toward the United States in a very pragmatic way. China had very effectively prevented a counter coalition by its accommodating and somewhat benevolent policies using free trade agreements and other friendly investment and other friendly methods, diplomatic and economic, up until about 2008, 2009. That's about two things happened then. The demand for a stronger U.S. foreign policy develops as China recovers so quickly from the global financial crisis, and there's a misperception of U.S. decline, which I'm happy to say now people in China do not perceive it that way. People in China see the U.S. recovery, and there's, I think, widespread, if you look at polls, quite widespread realization that China remains a much weaker economy, lower per capita income, and that the U.S. is an economy that's very strong and that they still respect very much. So up until that time, China's regional policy was really very successful, a kind of good neighbor policy. It was not bullying its neighbors. In the last, 7, 8 years, things have really gone off the rails in part because of weak leadership. And Xi Jinping appears to be determined to try to get things back on track. They've had a number of high-level meetings on peripheral diplomacy, which indicate, and he's made a lot of visits there. Apparently, he, like a lot of previous leaders in China, when they go to visit Southeast Asia, are shocked by the amount of resentment of China in Southeast Asia. So it appears that he's trying to get things back on track. With the United States, this APEC summit was really a dramatic success with achievements in 3 important areas of climate, military defense, crisis prevention, and also in trade. And Xi Jinping spent 9 hours with President Obama, more than all the other leaders combined, as Chinese friends tell me, and they always say, in a very pointed way, including Putin. So I think that Xi Jinping understands that it's in China's interest not to provoke the United States and its neighbors. And that he's in charge, very much in charge, and he's trying to take China in a way that's ambitious and helps establish China as an important power, but doing that primarily through multilateral initiatives in the region, through economic efforts, diplomacy. And it seems to me that that's something that is much better from the standpoint of the United States than the possibility of any kind of military confrontation. So I think it's important for the U.S. not to overreact and to frame everything in zero-sum terms and to see, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as somehow a threat to the United States.
Right.
I mean, we should take our cues from the way folks in the region react. And when they welcome this, we ought to applaud it. You know, it's fine if we want to urge that the proper standards of investment behavior, corporate social responsibility, et cetera, be followed. But I think it's a real mistake to get into a framing of rivalry that sees diplomacy and economic multilateral efforts as somehow hostile to us. But I want to conclude by saying that China still faces and Xi Jinping faces a big challenge in how he does handle these maritime territorial disputes. Because before all these different agencies started freelancing in the South China Sea, the South China Sea was not a hot-button focal point of Chinese nationalism. But now it is. Now it is. And not as intensely felt as relations with Japan, but something that the public pays close attention to. So how pragmatically can Xi Jinping manage these territorial disputes with Japan in the East China Sea and with China in the South China Sea is, I think, a real test of whether or not this strongman leadership will actually guide China in a peaceful way or be much more trouble in the future. Thank you.
Nicely done.
Well, it's interesting that there was a similarity of view between our three panellists, and it wasn't structured that way.
Very disappointing.
But when I was in Washington last week, I asked a number of senior officials, do you regard China as a threat? And everyone said yes. In fact, one said, of course. Now, maybe they're badly informed, or maybe it's become the sort of the set response. Yes, I'll let you. But I just wanted to say, David, on the pivot, how the pivot has turned out, I think, is as you described, but it didn't start that way. The first step was the military step. So you'd say, all right, there's a strong message being sent here militarily. But yet the military initiatives, you'd have to say, were pretty light touch. You know, a few Marines to Darwin that are only there in the months of good weather, literal combat ships, which are not really warships, to Singapore. So, and then afterwards we added a layer of diplomacy and a layer of trade. But even on the trade stuff, the language coming out of the White House is still a bit puzzling. You know, they say we're not trying to contain China, but a lot of the language, White House language on the TPP is in terms of competition with China. And interestingly, on the investment bank, the US administration now is saying this is not such a threat, provided they adopt the same standards. But when it was announced, they were horrified by it. You know, how dare China do this? Don't they understand we've got the World Bank and the IMF and so forth?
Oh, I understand that.
So forth. So aren't the messages that are being sent quite contradictory? And what does that tell us? A matter of interest, whilst you're thinking of the answer, if you asked leading Australian officials the same question on do you regard China as a threat, most would say no. Yeah. But that might be because we're a planet and not a sun.
Can I just comment on that? So, you know, there really is a very different mindset in Washington now than when I served in government 97 to 2000. At that time, when China behaved in some negative way, provocatively, we were sad. We felt, this is what's wrong. Our engagement policies aren't working. How do we adjust them? You know, we really had hope that this could all turn out well. And so we didn't celebrate when China did something negative. Nowadays, in the halls of the State Department and the Defense Department, especially, well, I won't say especially anywhere, but the whole mindset is if China does something negative, people are high-fiving one another, like, score one for our side.
Mhm.
You know, the Asian countries, China's Asian neighbors are going to come over to our corner. And the region is kind of cleaving into two blocks, which is not something that any of us wanted to see, and certainly not something China wanted to see. Now, China's own behavior is responsible for a lot of that, but it's, we definitely have this new competitive view. Now, in China too, you know, I think they view the relationship more competitively in a way that is not going to be easy to work with in the future.
But competition is part of life, isn't it? It's inevitable.
Yeah.
But, and Dave, if you're going to add to that, just answer also a question from me, and that is this issue, you say the transition is over because China has won the economic war vis-a-vis Japan. I don't think Japan sees it that way. It might accept that China has won the economic war, but I don't think they regard, in terms of influence, a transition as having taken place. They believe they still have an entitlement that's perhaps not being respected.
No, could I say something quickly, right? Because I think that's one of the reasons that I like being in California is I'm not in D.C.
Yay.
Right? Because there is, I mean, I spent a lot of time there. I know some of my best friends, this sounds so ridiculous, but they work in D.C. And there is an echo chamber there, right? And I don't understand a lot of times. I like being outside because you get a very different view. But I've seen that, right? And I've seen what I considered, frankly, a muddled view. One of the reasons they didn't have trade first is Obama didn't, in the first couple of years, have a trade policy towards Asia. And he got a ton of criticism from the Asian countries. So then it was added in. But even then, it's been skeptical whether Obama was truly involved in trying to get TPP passed. Maybe now we will, right? So I think that the pivot has been sort of laid out with some good principles, but it was sort of ad hoc, right? So I think that's on the American side. As to the sort of defensiveness or one for our team, absolutely, I see that. I don't have a good explanation for it. But I don't know that much about American politics. But let me talk a little bit about Korea and Japan, because I think it's a fascinating case. If you do opinion polls over and over again in Korea, they view the region like the most vivid one, and this happens regularly, is that if they ask on a 7-point scale to judge leaders, their own president, Park, will be like 6.4, Obama will be 6.1, Xi Jinping will be 5.9, and Abe and Kim Jong-un will be at 1.2. They view the Japanese leader the same they view North Korea's leader. And they view Japan as more of a threat than China. And again, when I do these talks, I used to say, you know, what are you thinking? But now you have to take it seriously. This is not, you know, this is an enduring view of the South Koreans. And it's partly wrapped up in, they have very similar views to China about Japan's role. And we don't have to like it. I mean, in some ways, you know, Americans go over there and say, what are you doing, Korea and Japan? You should agree. And the fundamental problem I think Abe has is this. I think Japan does have a role to play. I think Abe genuinely wants to reassert Japan's status as a first-tier nation, because I think almost everybody has written him off. The power transition's over, China's won, right? And he doesn't want to do that. He wants to reassert Japan's status as a first-tier leader in East Asia. And I think if he would do that, building on the post-1945 achievements of Japan, I don't think almost anybody would have a problem with that. It's been an extraordinary record. And what I think he runs into is he's going to go back to the the 1945, and he wants to revisit that as well. And that inevitably is going to lead to problems. It's even leading to problems in America now, where he's pressuring American textbook manufacturers. And that, I think, is going to be a problem for Abe.
So it sounds